and God divided the light from the darkness. There's more acts of division, right? We can see that there's a time and space when there was no distinctions. And then photons were able to transmit the differences, right? A separation in state space, the Big Bang, is very similar in spirit, in the sense that we are divided. So welcome to the second episode. Last episode we went through the Sabbath. This video is gonna be more focused on Cain and Abel, which is the story which comes right after Adam and Eve gets thrown out from the garden. I would advise you to look at that video first. So let's get right into it. The Sabbath was concerned with division, right? And it's interesting because if we follow the logic, is to realize that you could have something that is not the other, right? That is the simplest universe you can imagine. You have something that is not that, so you have two parts. And then, following the second law of thermodynamics, there is a yearning to get back to equilibrium. Get back to where there's symmetry, right? This is very analogous to something like free energy principle. Free energy principle is a mathematical framework yielded us by the scientific method, by Carl Friston, that concerns itself with bounded dynamic systems that are facing this exact problem, right? The part of asymmetry that we have been talking about. Any bounded dynamic system, like life or even simpler life, acts to want to alleviate this asymmetry. The second law of thermodynamics states that everything wants to come to the lowest energy state, right? This is equilibrium. So you can imagine that when you're sitting in the room and looking at the wall or whatever, your conscious construct gives a suggestion, like, okay, here is what I predict will happen. And when that prediction gets compromised, that is where attention lies. So a good example is something like when you stare at the wall, everything that happens in each splice of time is predictable, right? Nothing changes. But as soon as something happens to violate that prediction, then that gets cascaded down deeper into the brain, which activates systems that activates attention. And so you can imagine that if you are looking at a still wall, whenever there's movement or something that you didn't predict, that the brain didn't predict, that is prediction error. And so you could have large amount of prediction error, or you could have low. And this is what the free energy principle concerns itself with. Okay, so if you have a bounded system that has been dividing from, let's say in this example, God, right? Then you have an asymmetry between them. That is the symmetry break, right? And so of course there's going to be two distinct strategies to alleviate this asymmetry. And that is what I believe the Cain and Abel story tells us. That when you are faced with prediction error, there's two distinct ways you can go about alleviating that prediction error, right? To alleviate that asymmetry. And so, for example, when something doesn't go your way, you can choose to alleviate that asymmetry by reconfiguring the external realm. Let's say you're uncomfortable, right? It's too hot of a temperature. You could move away from that environment, right? You could change the external environment, but you could also just like, nah, f*** it, I'll eat this temperature, f*** it. Like, I'll just sit here and let my body regulate and whatever, right? This is internal reconfiguration to meet that asymmetry. So you can see, like, let's go through the Bible here. So you can see in chapter 4, Abel brings an offering to God, right? And that is his firstborn with the fat. This is a very precious thing. Like, fat is a symbol of richness. It doesn't make sense in the modern days, but fat was high nutritional value. So what Abel gave was basically his all, right? And then Cain came. And what does it say here? Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. And God did not respect Cain. He respected Abel. And so, why? What was he doing? What was Cain doing wrong? Like, what was he doing? Like, okay, I don't get it, right? So let's keep reading. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why are you angry, bro? If you do well, will you not be accepted?" He states. And if you do not do well, sin lies. Alright, so this is the first entry of sin, right? This is interesting. So the idea is that God didn't respect Cain. He simply said to Cain, well, if you do right, would not people respect you? Okay? And what does Cain come in response? Well, he kills his brother. This is quite a terrible response to asymmetry, right? Because God said, like, you can imagine that when Cain gave his offering, he was like, oh, I'm going to give this to God, and God is going to be happy, and everything is going to be well. But God wasn't happy, right? I mean, we can discuss probably why. I think this from a systemic lens, it sets up maybe that an hierarchy of things you could do, right? You could do things. There are things that help God better, but there are things that you can do that help God even better. So there's a hierarchy, right? And so it's interesting, right? So Cain's response to this asymmetry, right? He was expecting God to like him, but he was faced, no. God said, no, I don't respect you. This is a terrible, terrible response. When read from a systemic lens, the spirit of Abel isn't really being explored in this passage. This is something that comes later, explored through Abraham. So Abraham is being challenged, faced with adversities, and then God tests him. The Cain and Abel spirits seem to follow from a systemic lens what you do to alleviate prediction error. And so what did Cain do? Well, when faced with prediction error, right? When faced with adversities, he didn't sacrifice, he didn't readjust himself. He readjusted the world. He took and went out and killed Abel. This is an act of external configuration, right? In life, things can go wrong. And it's about what you do with that, right? You could do external modification to alleviate that, or you can do internal. It's immensely dense, right? And I think it speaks to something very fundamental. If everybody acts like Cain, right? If we collectively, all people, choose the path of Cain, which is to externalize, to change the external realm. If I find something indifferent, I change the external realm. But if someone else finds something other indifferent, if we both choose the strategy of Cain, you can imagine that the shared external realm that we all share, right, gets competed. I want to change the external realm here, you want to change the external realm here, and so there becomes a competition. And it's really interesting, right? Because if you look at, for example, the current economical environment, our society seems to have structures that promote heavily behaviors that go pedal to the metal. Like, this is the environment that we live in, like the capitalism. Create, progression, like boom, boom, boom. In a world where everything goes so fast, of course, we're gonna have a problem with sympathetic drive, right? This is the caffeine dilemma, right? Just fucking chug your caffeine and do your work, and that is how the world works, generally. Of course, there's gonna be a lot of pressure to mediate that collective sympathetic drive. This is what alcohol does, right? So you can imagine that, oh, of course, I mean, you have to chill after your day's work. This is you have to hit homeostasis. But you could, for example, just sit and meditate, right? You could engage in behaviors that are, let's say, better. But instead, you externalize the behavior. It's a lot easier to just chug yourself in with liquid and fix your problem instead of doing internal, right? I mean, it's probably not one-to-one, but you can get the feel of the different strategies, right? That you are able to, because you have a goal. There are things that needs resolving. And there are two distinct methods to go about this generally. Either you adjust the external realm or you adjust the internal realm. Please comment in the description if you want to correct something, if you want to add insight or whatever. And please subscribe, and I guess I'll see you next Sunday. Thanks for watching.